Hey there, listeners. This is Sarah Gobran, your host, and welcome to the Get Woke podcast. I hope you are all staying safe and staying home during this pandemic. And in today's episode, I'm going to be talking about the legal issues Indigenous people in Canada face, and more specifically, we're going to dive deep into the Indian Act. Now, Canada, as it claims, is one of the leading nations who claim to be fully reconciling with their Indigenous people. But let me tell you, we are nowhere near it. It has been all words, no action.
Mr. Speaker, I stand before you today to offer an apology to former students of Indian residential schools.
So, the Indian Act. It was first passed in 1876, and to this day it is still in force. It is the main and only big legislation that defines how the Canadian government interacts with registered Indians, and it deals with everything from their reserves, their lands, their health, education, and taxes. So, what's the big deal? Why am I making an entire episode on this? So, other than the fact that the language in it is archaic, it was made solely to assimilate or even annihilate, quote-unquote, the Indians. Some people might say, hey Sarah, but it was amended. Yes, it has been amended over 20 times, but the last major amendment happened in 2002, and there are still many issues in it. Here are some examples. The reserves belong to the federal government and not the Indigenous people. In Section 2, clearly states that the lands solely belong and are vested in Her Majesty, aka the federal government. In Section 20, it also goes to state, and I quote, "No Indian is lawfully in possession of land in a reserve unless with the approval of the minister." Minister, key word here. A lot of people don't know this, but there is a Minister of Indigenous Services. In almost every section, the minister is mentioned some way or another. And in every section, it is mandated that the minister is consulted, that the final say goes to him. So, who is our current Minister of Indigenous Services? Here's another example. In Section 51, and be ready for this, all jurisdictions and authority in relation to the property of mentally incompetent Indians is vested exclusively in the minister. Now, this is just one example of the kind of language that is used in this act to this day. Another thing that the minister can do is that he can operate farms or cultivate land if it's not in good use by the Indians. And he can employ people from out of reserves to help him to cultivate this land and quote-unquote instruct the Indians. Another example is it forces a colonial European idea and structure of how a government should work onto Indigenous peoples living in reserves. So, clearly, as you see, the band system that the Indian Act enforces is really not how traditionally the structures of governing work on reserves and for Indigenous peoples and First Nations. It usually comes down to hereditary chiefs, and as we saw with currently the pipeline issue, is that the government only consulted. So clearly this act is very controversial, and even after many amendments, it shows that the true colors of our government towards the so-called reconciliation. Now, I won't say that the government hasn't done anything. The government has tried to introduce new acts in the past, and most recently in 2002. The Minister of Indian Affairs at the time introduced the First Nations Governance Act. Now, here's the catch. Indigenous people were not consulted in the making of this act and any other acts that were introduced before this to replace the Indian Act. And of course, this was a big problem, and they were really only called after the act was introduced in the House of Commons. And since then, it seems like the government has not done anything else. I have researched, I have looked everywhere, and I could not find any more government action since that act. And really, since 2002, everyone is sort of in this limbo. As much as the Indian Act is horrible, as I've given you some examples, Indigenous people don't have any other legislation that separates them and gives them Indigenous identity. So rightfully, they are afraid that without another act in place, their identity will be erased. And that is the biggest issue here. So, since I could not find anything else of what our government is doing and what their plan is, I decided to talk to our writings, Member of Parliament and Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Indigenous Services, Pam Damoff, and ask her what our government is doing.
Hi, Sarah.
Hi. So really, like, the first question is, what is our government's current stance? Like, this current government stance on the Indian Act.
Yeah, so I mean, at Indigenous Services, our goal is not to exist, right? So, but we recognize that we can't just stop existing tomorrow, or there would be chaos in the system.
Exactly.
So what we're trying to do is move things over so that it's self-governed.
Yep.
And an example would be in British Columbia, where healthcare is now governed by the BC Health Agency. So they have their own. It's not being done through the federal government anymore. They're doing it on their own. So they're a model for the rest of the country as to how to do it. But ideally, what we're trying to do is make ourselves obsolete, Sarah. So, but if you just suddenly tore up the Indian Act tomorrow, it just wouldn't work. There's no systems in place to replace it. So we're trying to gradually, as quickly as we can, move away from what's in the Indian Act. And another one that we've done is the Family and Child Welfare Act that we passed last year, Bill C-92, to pass over control of child and family services to Indigenous communities. And the other thing that, and it's not my department, but the other thing that still needs to be done is negotiating treaties, right? We still have outstanding treaties that need to be negotiated, and that's under Carolyn Bennett's
the Crown
department. But our goal at Indigenous Services is to make the Indian Act obsolete so that Indigenous communities are governing themselves. Part of that too, Sarah, is building capacity with some of these communities to be able to do that on their own too. It's you need to train them, whatever individual communities need, and it's not the same across the country. Some are quite self-sufficient. Other ones don't have the capacity to. They're constantly dealing from crisis to crisis, and they don't have the capacity to put the systems in place to govern themselves. So it's working with individual communities, but also with the organizations across the country, like Assembly of First Nations, and then smaller ones too, like the Anishinaabe Nation, which is a collection of a number of Indigenous communities in Ontario. So working with them to try and help them develop the capacity to be able to deliver programs like education and housing and the infrastructure needs that they have. So we're working towards that, but we're nowhere near there yet.
All right. So really, you kind of answered my second question of like what is being done or has been done, because for what I saw, it was just kind of like the government was introducing new acts and substantive legislation to put in place of the Indian Act, and none of those were really working out because, it wasn't you can't have a one-size-fits-all. So after that, like, what is being done currently?
So some of it may not even be by legislation, though. So I'd give you an example of water in communities and wastewater, right? Where we've gone in and you want someone to build a water treatment plant, but you also need workers trained to do the maintenance in the
Exactly.
Water treatment plant. So we're providing funding to some communities, so not only to build the plant, but also to be able to train people within the community, or to train people that can work in several communities. Maybe there's not enough work in just one, where they could work in like 6, and then eventually you could transfer responsibility for that over. So it's not required legislatively, but trying to say, okay, what do you need? How do we make that happen? And how do we work with you to see that it's done in a smooth transition? But we don't want to make decisions like we've done over the last 150 years, where we say this is the right way to do it. So we're working closely with Indigenous peoples to make sure that the choices we're making are the right ones for them.
And then, is there a plan to even still make a new act or some sort of legislation that still ensures that their rights are protected and their status is still Indian? Because, that is very important to them. So is there a plan for that, or are we still going to keep the Indian Act?
I don't know, Sarah. There's nothing planned in the short term.
Okay.
So I don't know.
And then lastly, do you think the media has been unfair to the current government when it comes to this topic? Because it feels like the media is kind of like they're doing nothing, full stop.
Yeah, and I think, after 2015, I think there were really high expectations on what we would be able to do. And to be honest, I think we're partly to blame for that. Nothing had been done for so long that I think there was an expectation that we could fix it immediately. And some of these things are systemic problems that it's not even a matter of putting more money towards it. It's solving really serious infrastructure programs. So we are doing a lot, but there's so much to do, and it's so complicated.
Well, thank you so much, Pam, for talking to me today and joining me today on this podcast. After speaking to you, I do realize that this is out to all the listeners, that this is very complicated and cannot be solved in one day, let alone 4 years or 8 years. The government has to really go back and make up for 150 plus years. So basically, all of Canada's history since the Europeans came to Canada and when things got bad for our Indigenous people. And I think people should realize that and really try to think, how can this be fixed, and realize that there are so many problems before it can be fixed. And that's it for today's episode. Thank you for listening. Stay safe and stay woke.